Hi, welcome to Community Empowerment. I'm Roberta Martin, your host and your interviewer. Tonight we'll be talking about the One Minnesota Equity Blueprint. With me in the studio is Jane Leonard, Growth and Justice, President of Growth and Justice, and Dane Smith, President Emeritus, Growth and Justice. Welcome both.
Thank you.
Jane, why don't you take a minute and just do an introduction, a brief introduction of yourself, and then Dane will take it from there.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'm Jane Leonard, as you said, and I have been president of Growth and Justice since January of this year. Prior to that, I was the state broadband grants administrator, so I traveled around the state doing a lot of equity work for rural communities in terms of making sure that they had high-speed broadband. A lot of grant work and working with communities and providers of those services. And I've had a long career in community and economic development here and across the country.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'm Dane Smith, and I was the president of Growth and Justice for about a decade. 10 years. Before that, I was a journalist. I was a newspaper reporter for the Star Tribune and the Pioneer Press, and covered politics and state and local government, federal government. I covered government at every level, and both the politics and policy. And so I got a pretty good training there and issues that Minnesotans care about, and so it was a good transition for the last 10 years of my career to be at Growth and Justice, which is a policy shop. We are interested in public policy that provides for economic growth, but also for economic justice.
Thank you very much. Let's start by, first of all, defining some labels and terms. Your organization name for starters, and how does Growth and Justice fit for the word equity, in which I've been reading most on your websites and on your materials.
Right. Well, equity actually is a term that has come into vogue, and it's a great term actually to describe what we're about. We have some serious inequalities in our society. There's regional disparities. There are some places in Minnesota that are not doing well at all. Unemployment is too high, underemployment is too high, wages are low, the investment from the private sector lags behind the Twin Cities, for instance. So we know that greater Minnesota suffers from disparities. An even bigger concern is racial disparity. We are an increasingly diverse state, and we have widening inequalities on attainment, education attainment, on income and wealth. These are a serious threat to our future. And then there's economic inequality just between the top and the bottom, not regardless of race, between folks who are increasingly struggling in the lower middle class and among those in official poverty, and top 1% that is getting more and more of the wealth and income. Huge problem. Everybody agrees that if this continues to get worse, all of us will suffer. So and these conditions are the very reason that we exist at Growth and Justice, because we know that from a lot of science and economics that growth occurs when justice occurs. When everybody's potential is realized, everybody's human potential, when there's investment in people's education, when folks have equal opportunity, they become better employees, better citizens, more productive, they have more money to buy things, which drives the economy. And so that's the whole principle that Growth and Justice was founded on in 2002, 16 years ago. We think we've accomplished some important milestones in getting this idea in front of Minnesotans and helping them understand what really works for a successful society. So the whole idea, again, is that economic growth depends on social justice, that we all do better when we all do better.
Absolutely.
Which Paul Wellstone famously said, and others have too.
Thank you. Jane, you're
Yeah.
a president now. What
Yeah.
is your thought on what Dane is talking about?
Yeah, well, it's one of the reasons I was attracted to apply for the job, actually.
Absolutely.
I've worked a lot in rural Minnesota and saw some of the disparities that Dane has mentioned. I've also worked in urban areas. And I was I worked for the youth coordinating board actually in Minneapolis almost 10 years ago. And that's when people were starting to realize that even though we might be #1 in education, in some respects, the achievement gap was just glaring among kids of color. And so we kind of hide behind some of the #1s, but once you disaggregate the data, you're really starting to see the inequities. And so I had in my career seen the imbalances that can happen between a totally market-based economy versus one that also cherishes a civic society. And so the growth and justice of Growth and Justice was incredibly appealing to me. And I feel like I fit right in.
She sure does.
Absolutely.
So,
Our
yeah.
board and I am so pleased that Jane has joined us. Her expertise in greater Minnesota in rural areas is such an important addition to our understanding of what Minnesota needs to do. And this has really come into play. The recent elections showed nationally and in Minnesota this big divide opening up, a huge partisan divide between rural folks and metro folks. And we don't think that's good in the long run. And we see too often this arguments being made that are actually kind of malicious and antagonistic between the regions, where rural people
and untrue.
Falsely accuse the metro area of taking all the resources, when in fact metro actually pays a lot of the taxes that go into roads and that benefit rural areas. And vice versa. We actually see a lot of times metro people looking down on rural people and not understanding sufficiently what their life is like and their needs and what they need to do. So a big part of our work, and Jane is ideally equipped to lead this, is to get rural and urban together, and we're very much involved in that whole enterprise.
Let's go a little bit deep into talking about the dimensions of inequality and racial disparity problems in Minnesota. What are some of the dimensions by which we can see the disparities and the racial discriminations within Minnesota?
Well, I'll just take a stab, and then Jane can follow up. I think one of the, let's not overlook the obvious: income.
Right.
We know that African Americans, Native Americans, people of African immigrants, Latinos have, on average, about half the, or 33% lower income. The wealth gap is even larger, according to national studies. By one measure, just pure, net worth, African American families, according to one study, have only about $10,000 in net worth. Well, white families, on average, have more than $120,000. That's a factor of 10 to 1.
Absolutely.
That's outrageous, and then it extends all the way to things like health, longevity. American Indians live on average 10 to 15 years, even 20 years shorter lives than white people do. Another factor is general health, everything from low birth weight babies to you name it, all kinds of health problems. Affects that longevity. Then there's education. The post-secondary completion rate, where you get at least a 2-year degree or a credential that allows you to work. The rate, the difference in that between the white population and actually the Asian population, and every other racial group is big. It's too big. About 80% of or 85% of white kids graduate from high school. The rate is around 60% for every for some of those other racial groups. And then the post-secondary completion, the college thing is similar. Big gaps, and we know we've got to drive that not bring one down, but lift the other up.
Exactly.
And so those are just some of the disparities on race, and it manifests itself in a lot of ways. Incarceration rate is way too high for people of color, and a lot has been written about mass incarceration and the fact that policies have been intentionally biased against people of color.
Jane, what do you think about, as he was talking, I was thinking about a lot of things running in my head. You would think about Dr. King's speech all these years, right? You would think about 8 years of President Obama in office, and we still have all of these problems. What is your thought on that?
Yeah, well, we've talked a lot about that. Dane and I were both alive in 1968, and it's the 50th anniversary of many of those strides forward, and in some ways I think we were cresting the hill, and now we're falling behind again. Dane mentioned the income disparities and the wealth disparities, and I think one of the things is home ownership. White people tend to have more wealth because, and I put myself in that category, because
most of that wealth is home equity.
Home equity, right? And you can borrow off of that, and so you're already set. And so I think it's just getting that rising awareness of white privilege, if you will, and upper income privilege, where the cycle just keeps going, and at the lower income and among people of color, just even getting a start sometimes is so difficult.
Absolutely.
Another take on this is that when I came to Minnesota in 1970, I was about in my early 20s. Minnesota actually had less inequality than most states. It was about 98% white, and because of progressive policies, which provided a lot of opportunities, especially in education, our white population was considerably better off than in other states where there was less public investment in these important things. So it was a great state if you were, but it was mostly white. And then the diversity really began to improve. Diversity that is helping us in many ways, giving us creative new
entrepreneurial energy,
and it's just improving our lives in many ways. But now we're at 20% people of color, from 1% to 20% in just 40 years. That is an amazing increase. And so we need to really, Minnesotans, I think, is really just beginning to be aware of how important equity is in terms of sustaining our quality of life, for which we're pretty famous, and extending it and making sure that that quality is enjoyed by all our newcomers and our growing percentages of people of color. If we do right by them, they'll do right by us, and we'll all do better.
Right.
Well, I think it's one of the reasons why Growth and Justice was started, and certainly the relevancy now of making investments in education and business development and business financing,
early childhood,
all those things, particularly in the populations where diversity is high. I mean, you look even at Greater Minnesota. There are some communities where 60% of the kids in school are kids of color. There are many different languages being spoken in those schools, and that's not only our future workforce, it's our workforce right now.
Exactly.
And so we really are, and Growth and Justice, I think, did a great job a couple of years ago with the smart investments in education and transportation and all the ways that we can kind of lift up more equitable access and investments.
It was kind of a blueprint for birth to career education, focusing on equity, focusing on the very specific best practices that that help kids do better in school, and there was a lot of emphasis on early childhood education, remediation, tutoring, and the special help that kids need to catch up.
So
And-
as I listen to you too, it looks as if the disparities are spread across the spectrum.
Yes.
You mentioned education, housing, what else? Education, housing, healthcare.
Health and healthcare, right?
Yeah, longevity.
Right.
I mean, I'm just sitting here really, thinking about some researches that I have read about, from Dr. Bruce Corey. Dr. Bruce Corey
Yes.
wrote something about immigrant contribution to Minnesota economy. And when I read that, I realized that immigrants that live in Minnesota really hugely contribute to the economy.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
And if that is the case, then why is it that we still have these disparities? I mean, we are here. I'm an immigrant. I came from somewhere and became a citizen, right? So we are here contributing to this economy. Why is it that there's still all these problems going on? The
Right.
question is, where is this coming from? Where is this problem coming from? I know that we can go back to history, right, and look at all the racism and segregation and all of that.
Right.
But after many years of Dr. King and President Obama and all of that,
Yeah.
we're still here on the end
Yeah.
of the ladder.
Yeah,
Yes.
I was
So-
fortunate enough to be able to work some with Dr. Corey, and he's actually going to be a speaker at our event in Granite Falls, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit later.
Yeah.
But definitely, you hit the nail on the head with.
Thank you.
Yes, the immigrant populations in particular have brought to Minnesota an incredible entrepreneurial energy, and I think, and I speak from some experience because I worked a lot with small business development and entrepreneurship in Greater Minnesota, and we were working with Somali and Bosnian refugees, for example, in the Fargo-Moorhead area to help not only provide some financial information and financing, but also to start to shift our policies so that there's more welcoming of startup businesses and entrepreneurship in general.
More access to capital.
Yeah, I think across the board in the U.S. and I think certainly here in Minnesota, there's interest and there's emphasis on some of the bigger companies, which is a fine thing. But we also have to work with smaller company development, and that's where a lot of the newcomers get started. They've got great ideas.
Right.
So that's part of what we want to try to push as well.
I think an important factor, it's important to just name this, is
Yes.
racial bias,
It's
racial
racial
discrimination. It's uncomfortable to talk about that.
Absolutely.
But it's the evidence just
Very clear.
is clear
Yeah.
that in fact African Americans or people of African descent with the same level of education as the white counterparts
Absolutely.
have lower incomes, less likely to be hired. That's discrimination. That's clear.
Before we get a little bit more deeper into it, let's be a little bit realistic because we're talking about it, right? If we
Right.
don't talk about it, there's not going to be an improvement and there's not going to be solutions.
Right.
And
Right.
so I think that's the reason why both of you are into this field.
Yes.
So, for example, let's look at housing or let's even look at employment issue, right? I think that employment is the biggest one because without employment and healthcare and then jobs, healthcare and
Having a steady income that supports your family.
education,
Yeah.
all of that, right,
Right.
becomes. So if we look at, our employment system, where can we point, and not necessarily pointing at a person, but where can we point to where the problem is? Because before we solve the problem, we have to analyze, we have to sit down and see where are the root of these problems.
Right.
Okay, so if we look at employment, what are some of the things you can think about that generate those disparities?
One thing that we know works very well in training underemployed young people of color and getting them into that first credential where their career can be
pipeline,
well
yeah.
paid is these career pathway models, which are kind of expensive. They require some navigation and for for populations or families that have never had anybody go to college. There's some learning that has to take place and some actual sort of coaching that needs to happen. And so these career pathway programs are sort of funded through a patchwork of some federal and state and nonprofit money. We've done quite a bit of research and advocacy for more career pathway programs. It will require more money. It requires more investment, and it pays off just very handsomely, though. It's an investment, it's not spending. So we need to reduce, I like to say, this is a little radical idea, we need to pay people to go to college. It pays off so well. Not, we need to make it an entitlement so that people are actually entitled, you know, right now you're entitled to 12 years.
Right.
You get it no matter what. It's not free, it comes from taxes, but it's an entitlement. We need to make 14 years of education an entitlement so that everybody can, as long as they can finish the course and do the work, get that 2-year degree or that trade credential for a good job. So we're going to have to put some dollars on the table, and this means changing our attitudes about being anti-government or anti-tax. This means people with resources who depend on this workforce and whose children will depend on it in the future need to repay what they've, you know, the benefit that they've
that they're getting
getting
Yeah.
from.
And Jen, you want to
our
say something?
society.
Yeah.
Well, I just, you know, I'm right along with Dane.
Dane.
The cradle to career pathway is so important. You know, one of the things that has really popped up on the radar across the state, but particularly I think in greater Minnesota, is the lack of childcare and the affordability of childcare. And running childcare as a business, which for the first time, I think in a long time, our economic development community is starting to see that they have to help their communities make investments in childcare as a business, as well as a great place to start a child off on that career pathway.
We're talking high quality childcare.
Yeah, you know, I was astounded by some of the shortages in some of the communities across the state. You know, 300 slots that are, you know, needed in some small towns. So you just, you know, think about that. And then of course here in the suburbs and urban areas, same thing is happening. So, you know, part of what I think is the special thing about growth and justice is that we try to look at a lot of these issues across the board. It's not just one issue. It's how does one issue relate to another one. So childcare and transportation usually go together for families.
We need transit
mobility.
for low-income people. Need rides to work and to destinations in greater Minnesota as well as urban areas. So we've been big advocates for build out the light rail system and better transit options for folks. Really important to get them to the good jobs in the suburbs, for instance.
I did a research on childcare versus its relation to education and the achievement gap, and I realized how close they are.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
Those first 3 years, first 5 years are
And
critical.
let's not forget healthcare too. How important it is to make that an entitlement for everybody, so that every human in this state is entitled to quality health care, also from birth all the way through end of life. And this will require either an extension of Minnesota Care, which is kind of a sliding fee program, which you pay a little bit into, or Minnesota, and we've talked about this or done research that suggests Minnesota could go ahead with its own universal publicly financed healthcare system.
You know, research shows that we, as United States citizens, are really on the bottom when it comes to free healthcare and quality healthcare compared to the European countries such as Switzerland and England and
every other developed country, including Japan, Canada,
France.
most of the European countries have this universal healthcare publicly financed system.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, you know, let's move on to the next topic. You have a big event coming up.
Yes.
We do.
Let's talk about that.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Go ahead.
Jane,
Should I?
Yeah, take the lead on
well,
this.
I think what we've been talking about is a perfect lead-in to this event. And it's an event that kicks off a process. So
Okay.
it's not just one time. It's a gathering of, I would say, the Minnesota family, the Minnesota community, shall we say, in the Upper Sioux community and Granite Falls in the southwest part of our state. And that it's at the end of June, June 27th through the 29th. We are hoping to get delegates and/or general attendees from across the state, but particularly we're trying to recruit people from each of the state Senate districts and the 11 Native nations that are here in Minnesota. And they don't have to be elected people. We want citizens. We want residents. You don't have to be a citizen, in fact, to come together and learn about what's happening in Minnesota, look at the trends, the facts, all the things we've been talking about with these disparities, but also the things that are really looking up and some great ideas that are happening across the state in childcare and in transportation and agriculture and arts and culture. And so we're going to kind of take the big picture and also bring it down to specific topics for all these folks. And then they are going to sit down at a table like this and start to put together what we're calling the One Minnesota Equity Blueprint.
What's one thing that's unusual about this is we're holding it in a small town in western Minnesota.
right?
And so there'll be a lot of urban folks going out to Granite Falls. It's really unusual for a conference or a convening of this scale that's focused on a statewide policy. Almost always they're held in the cities or
St.
Cloud or
maybe.
Rochester or some of the
Yeah.
bigger
Okay.
cities.
Yeah.
And this one is really going to be held in a small town. And we think it'll afford a lot of interaction and learning between urban and rural.
Okay.
And just sort of an
Bridging and
appreciation
connections.
for,
Yeah.
Well,
for,
that
for
type-
rural communities, which are increasingly suffering from these disparities, economic between top and bottom, and racial too. I just want to throw in an interesting
Sure.
fact I just heard. The two most diverse communities in Minnesota by city, municipality, this is surprising, I think, to a lot of people. It's, you'd think, okay, it's got to be Minneapolis and St. Paul, right?
Right.
Not true. It's Brooklyn Center.
Really?
It's
Brooklyn
right
Center.
Here. Yeah, right. And the other one is Worthington, Minnesota, which is out in southwestern Minnesota,
Where
not
we're
far from
having-
where we're
yeah.
having this gathering. These fairly small municipalities. Brooklyn Center, of course, is an old suburb. It was one of the first to develop. But it's, as North Minneapolis population moved into the suburbs, it became more diverse. And Brooklyn Center and a suburb and a rural city are the two most diverse communities. And that's the story of the future of Minnesota. That's
That
happening.
is quite interesting
Yeah.
because Brooklyn Park is densely populated
Right.
by immigrants,
Right.
particularly from the western part of Africa.
Right.
So we're looking, and also people from the Hmong community. So Brooklyn Park, Brooklyn Center, New Hope, Robbinsdale,
Right.
all of these municipalities are all densely populated, but particularly Brooklyn Park.
Yes.
And
We know this.
yeah,
Yeah.
and people that are densely populated are Western Africans. So Ghana, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Togo, you know,
Right.
on the western part of Africa. And then you have the Cambodians, and then
Yeah.
people from
Right.
the Laos. And
Right.
so I'm wondering, this is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, and you know, part of it is that families follow families.
Absolutely.
And that's what's been happening in southwest Minnesota. There, in fact, in Walnut Grove, I think we had the first Hmong city council person,
Right.
probably in the state, in Walnut Grove.
Walnut Grove is famous to white families because they all
Little House
read
on the Prairie.
Little House on the Prairie. That was where Laura Ingalls
Yeah.
Wilder was raised.
Yeah.
And that community now is becoming more diverse. There's
Very
a town in
diverse.
western Minnesota that is entirely made up of, is it
Micronesians.
Micronesians?
Yeah, Milan,
Right.
Minnesota.
And of course, the Latino population drives a lot of this. The migrant workers who
Wilmer.
came from Mexico and Central
Right.
America
Right.
are a big part of our mosaic. And these communities are contributing mightily to our to our state. You mentioned this before, Roberta. There's study after study shows that they are a net benefit.
Absolutely.
That there might be some costs involved in resettling people and helping them
early support, just getting started.
Get started, and some various social programs that cost, but they actually contribute more to the economy from work and entrepreneurial activity than they take.
Right. Well, you know, Dane, you had already, and Jane, you have too, already talked about why you want to go all the way to Granite Falls.
Yeah.
Well, my understanding is, help me to understand this. So, you could have done this in a Twin Cities someplace,
Right.
you know, because of the population that we have here. You could even choose to go to Rochester or even Duluth.
Yeah.
Or
Why?
Brainerd Lakes, where
Right.
a lot of conferences go
Absolutely.
because of all the lakes.
Yeah, and have some fun and talk about some
and
equity
you can have
issues.
fun up there too, but
So
yeah.
why all the way very close to the border of South Dakota?
Yes.
Is there a history?
I'm gonna
Is there a
take this
story
one.
there?
Take that one.
I'm gonna
Take it away.
Okay.
Take this one. The story of southwestern Minnesota is the story of our state.
Okay.
I mean, they have embraced the changing face of Minnesota in probably more ways than anywhere else in the state. And in fact, we're having Diana Anderson come and do the welcome. She's the president of the Southwest Initiative Foundation. They have a 10-year commitment at least to grow your own.
Grow our own is a big initiative.
They
right?
understand totally, even at the last census, that without immigration of either newcomers from somewhere in the United States or newcomers from other countries, that the population would have been just declining. Yeah. And so the investments that are being made there in immigrants and people of color, it's really kind of astounding. And so I think that in many ways it's a model. And I know of some folks that have been working on diversity training well before it was, you know, kind of a watchword here in the Twin Cities. Down in Worthington and other places. So I think it's just a great role model for us. And being a rural gal at heart, helping people see that there's so many beautiful places in Minnesota that aren't up north. This is where the Minnesota River takes its turn towards the Twin Cities. There's beautiful prairie and hill country there. We're going to be
history.
History's incredible there. We're going to be at the Upper Sioux community, which are the Dakota people. They are hosting us there alongside the Granite Falls people. So it's just a great opportunity to see another part of our community of Minnesota that we share.
There's another reason too. We know that a lot of this hostility, this foolish hostility towards immigrants and people of color, comes from some misguided folks in rural Minnesota, and by holding, it's more than symbolic to hold an event that is focused on equity and how it pays off in a rural community. And most of the leadership in rural communities is not hostile. They are responsible folks who understand the need to welcome and embrace newcomers. And there was a big story on the front page of the Star Tribune recently about how many communities all over Minnesota are becoming welcoming communities, and they're following certain procedures around how you do that, and how you educate folks, and how you embrace the newcomer. And yet, every time they do this, there's some small cadre of angry white folks who will show up and say, no, we don't want this. We think we're better if we stay homogenous and white forever, and that's our strength. And we just think that's wrong. But
the change is happening. So,
and the change is happening.
You know,
So with that said, can you hold on to that point there?
Yeah.
With that said, doesn't necessarily means that people that live within, you know, white people that live in those rural areas are really consider themselves as white privilege and wouldn't like to mix up with other race, you know, such as immigrants that are living here within the Twin City. Then, is that the notion?
We think that there are actually a large percentage who do want to welcome who do want to embrace. And many of them are city council members and mayors and economic planners, some of the most responsible people in the community. But we can see the election results from the last presidential election. We know what was said by a candidate who appealed to this white nationalism,
Right.
And we're very concerned about it, and we want to thwart it,
Right.
and refute it.
So in a nutshell, this is why we're going to Granite Falls.
That's right, because we are connecting not only whites with people of color, but rural people with urban people,
Right.
with
Right.
metro people.
It is
yeah.
it's a constructive effort to
Constructive
unify the state
Absolutely.
around a blueprint, and the outcome from this will be a policy blueprint for the state that covers the range of things that Jane can
From
elaborate on
agriculture
a little
to
bit here.
infrastructure to public safety and criminal justice, we're going into many different topics. Yeah.
Let's talk about who is attending this convening and who will be the speaker.
Sure. Well, we have a lot of speakers. Some
Okay.
people have told us that there's too much going on, but I think, just speaking for myself, but I think I can speak for the staff at Growth and Justice. I mean, the time is now. You know, we really
It
want
is
to.
now.
We want to help people understand what's going on. So we are having Tribal Chairman Kevin Jensvold kick off a welcome. He's from the Upper Sioux community. He'll be among the first speakers that night, and that's Wednesday the 27th.
Very important to have a Native American
yeah.
kick this off.
Right.
in
Absolutely.
their community. Yeah. And Kevin Lindsay, the Human Rights Commissioner for
that's
the
great.
state, is going to
Yeah.
be speaking that night as well.
Kelvin Lindsay is an African American, is
Yes.
that right? Yes.
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 Yep.
And
Yeah.
then Bruce Corey,
Oh,
who you
great.
mentioned, will be a
He'll
speaker.
be the next
Correct.
day. Yep. Yeah.
The state demographer, who is very
Susan.
astute,
Susan Brower.
Susan Brower, will be a speaker.
She will be here in 2 weeks.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Great.
You might talk to her about that.
Right, absolutely
Get
I
her
will.
prepped.
Definitely I will.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So
Craig-
she's part of this.
She's going to be one of our leadoff speakers on Thursday, which we're calling affectionately Data Download Day, but I kind of also like to call it Wisdom Gathering Day.
Right.
And so Susan will be kicking off the speakers there. Actually, Diana Anderson will be kicking things off in the morning with a welcome and some time to just share with folks there who are coming from all across the state. Share their story in Southwest Initiative Foundation of how they are bringing people together and how they are investing in education and entrepreneurship and have been doing that for many years and continue their commitment on that. So Susan will be there. Craig Helmstedter's going to follow Susan. He used to be with Minnesota Compass. He's now head of the American Public Media Research Lab, and they've been doing all the ground level surveys of kind of the state of our views about each other, rural and urban.
We're a serious research organization, so facts are important
Facts
to
are
us.
important.
Right,
So
very
that'll
important.
be a lot of
Yeah.
backgrounding in what the facts are around
Exactly.
inequality. But one thing I want to mention too,
Yes.
as an existential problem, another one, a problem that threatens our existence. Equity is one.
Right.
Another one is climate change.
Climate change.
Uh,
Absolutely.
Huge, important issue for Minnesota. We don't have any fossil fuels. We need to reduce our reliance and use of these. And Minnesota's already moving forward on a shift to renewable energy. That will be a major theme in this conference as well. So it'll be equity and climate change.
Yeah, and when you're driving there or taking the bus there, you may see the wind turbines and the solar farms. It's pretty incredible what's happening
Right.
out in our state with
It's
that.
really exciting
Yeah.
what's happening. We want to accelerate that move towards climate action
Right.
and towards reliance on renewable energy. There are so many jobs there. For young underemployed people of color, we need to train that underemployed workforce in these installation jobs for solar and wind. And conservation.
Right.
There's a tremendous opportunity there.
Are we-
So environment fits with equity.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
definitely.
Yes. Environment do fix with equity. Are we going to have people out of state coming as well? Are we also going to have some governance from people, policymakers,
Well,
join you? Because this is
Yeah,
directly going into policy.
well, in fact, that's part of our intent, is that we sort of start off with Minnesotans coming together to say this is what we would like the blueprint to be for the next couple of years, and in particular, since we are going to get a new governor, whatever happens.
Right.
And
Is he invited, Dane?
Yes,
Okay.
we're inviting candidates. It's hard to know whether they're going to be able to show up. We don't even know who the candidates are. We'll know after this weekend
Right.
a little better idea who the
Right.
candidates for governor are.
Right.
But the whole idea of this blueprint that we're going to put together at the end of the year is to give it to the new governor,
For policy.
whoever that is.
and
Right.
the legislature.
We're a nonpartisan C3 group, so we've been inviting candidates of both parties to help us with this process. But we haven't. It's not really a thing designed for elected officials. It's more for ordinary citizens
Right.
and
So it should be
It's-
party exempted. Very
Yes, exactly.
nonpartisan,
It's,
right?
Yes.
I mean, it's part of your show here about community empowerment.
Thank you very much.
It really is about bringing the community together
Right.
as people sharing these ideas, and we definitely are sharing them back with elected officials. I should say too, and I want to make sure we mention this, that we are co-hosting this with onemn.org, and that's
Okay.
another organization you might want to have on your show sometime. They too have been around for about 16, 17 years. In fact, Dr. Bruce Corey helped start that organization. And they are a coalition of organizations, primarily people of color, who've been working towards some of the same goals that we have in terms of economic equity and inclusion. And so we are working on this event and the process together. And so that in of itself, I think, is another unique factor here with both the event and the process, that we're trying to bring people rural and metro together. We're trying to bring people of color together. And all of us are sharing this deep concern that we need to come together and invest in ourselves,
Right.
and so that our future is bright together. And Dr. Corey, he's going to talk about the shared sustainable prosperity model that he and others with onemn.org have put together. We're also going to have another model that I've worked with called Community Capitals Framework.
You probably will be coming back to talk about
Okay,
that
we
too.
can do a whole show on that, because
Okay.
right.
it
And
really
hopefully bring Brett Buckner from
We'll bring-
oneminnesota.org. Or
Brett
Okay.
Buckner's
Bruce Corey.
our counterpart at onemn.org with
Right.
with Bruce. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
We've got other partners too that have been working with us. The Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities, the Minnesota Asset Building Coalition. We've drawn a lot of inspiration and advice over the years from groups like Voices for Racial Justice, and the councils, the ethnic councils, the Council for Minnesotans of African Heritage, and the Latino Council and the Asian Council.
Native
So all of
American.
these
Excellent.
players are
You've been
invited.
really working
We've been
pretty
working
hard.
hard.
Yes,
We've
we
been
have.
talking to a lot of people.
Yeah.
I was wondering, I wanted to ask this question. How can we, this sounds really interesting, and it's a good thing, right? When we
Yeah.
do well, everybody else do well,
Right.
right?
Help
So I
each
was
other.
thinking about how can you guys get this whole thing into practice and law? How possible can this be?
Into law.
Into law
Yeah.
and into practice.
That's
That's the
Because
hard
at the
part.
end of the day,
Right.
you had mentioned we're going to present this to the governor, whoever that person may be.
Right.
But how can we get this into
Right.
law?
Well,
practice.
we've had some success around cradle to career education models, education. We've been part of a broad coalition that has really increased early childhood education funding in this state
Right.
dramatically. So we think we've been effective in partnership with other groups. We're a pretty small organization ourselves. We can't make stuff happen. We can't
Right.
raise millions of dollars and fund candidates the way some interest groups can. But we think we serve as a conscience and sort of a place where people can see the
hub
whole
almost, yeah.
can see the whole picture.
yeah.
And so this document will be important. The One Minnesota Equity Blueprint. It'll provide sort of a
Broad
a
perspective.
broad perspective where you can see it all in one place.
Absolutely.
All the important pieces that drive equity
Yeah.
and that build a more equitable growth and business growth. The other thing that we need to emphasize is how strongly the business community agrees with us on so many of these things. You know, a lot of times it's presumed that business ownership is at odds with progressive social activist types,
Right.
when in fact there's a lot of common ground. Business in this state believes in renewable energy. They are behind that idea. They want transit. They want to immigrants. They desperately need workers.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
that is a crucial aspect to our work that I just wanted to emphasize is how strongly we can build connections with the business community, the people who own and own stock in Minnesota businesses.
We have about 14 minutes. We still get a little time. Jane, why don't you talk about some of the labels and some of the things that will be discussed? I
Sure.
know
Yeah.
you've touched on so many of them, but
Yeah.
yeah.
You know, we'll be there for about 2 days, starting on an afternoon and then having a full day and then another kind of morning, early afternoon. And as I said, we're going to kind of start at the big picture and then drill down into some topic areas, and we're calling those igniter
Okay.
topics because they will be people who are deep into each of these topics. For example, you know, we'll have people talking about housing, and we'll have people talking about the climate action and the renewables, people talking about childcare and all aspects of education from the cradle to the higher ed credentialing. And we don't have a whole lot of time, but we are going to make use of some of our millennial friends' processes and have just, you know, really quick bursts of this is what's happening in this topic. These are some of the ideas. These are some of the challenges.
These are some of the policy alternatives.
Policy alternatives, right. And then we will have time for people to actually go to tables and talk to these
so there'll be
folks.
representatives.
Yes,
Right.
so though each of these topics will have more than one table talking about certain aspects of those policy topics or what have you. And that way, as people go into the next day, which is where we really sit down and build that blueprint, they will just have their head full of ideas and connections with people that are already on the ground doing some of this work, people that they may know of already or they don't know, and they're making great connections. And it's just the start, really. We want to emphasize that from Upper Sioux community in Granite Falls, we are working with all these delegates. We're committed not only for the next 6 months, but you know, the next couple of years. We see this as our legislative agenda as well. You asked about, you know, what about the legislature? All of us, you know, really want to take this agenda that is coming from the people and moving it forward to more communities to get more input over the fall of 2018. And then, as we've talked about, presenting it to the governor and the legislature, but then keeping working on it in this network.
Right. We do advocate. We go to the Capitol. Jane and I are both registered lobbyists. We get in front of committees and say, we hope you vote for this and that and the other. So there will be some follow through in terms of enactment, but we don't actually move an agenda all by ourselves. We have so many partners that we collaborate with involved in this event and going forward that will join various coalitions, Early Childhood Coalition, for instance, career pathway advocates, healthcare advocates, environmental renewable energy advocates, and sort of be a connector for the groups.
Yeah, and you know, this is, we started out thinking that about 30 years ago, Minnesota had a fairly comprehensive plan put into place, in part because of the farm crisis then and the recession then. And it really has been about 30 years since we've had a much more comprehensive, multi-issue, multi-sector kind of approach. And so even though it's a lot to chew on, because of how we approach these issues in a more comprehensive, multi-issue way and multicultural way, this will be one of the first times I think that we are bringing together not only individuals but coalitions. So it's almost like a coalition of
It's a
coalitions.
coalition.
And not that we want to run things. That's we're trying to be a place where people can come together.
Advocating.
Yeah, right. And then advocating back out and having a shared voice together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, what we're about is not exactly revolutionary or new.
No.
There's a great, I think there are groups all over the country who are
Right.
concerned about equity.
Equity.
And I wrote an op-ed for the Star Tribune couple years back, defining the term and how important it was to understand what is meant by equity.
Right.
It is not perfect equality, but giving people a stake, a share of the whole
Enterprise.
society and the enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want to drive things like home ownership and build assets for people, to build wealth and the foundation for that.
Absolutely.
And it's not about handouts and giveaways, but building that from the bottom
Actually
up.
building.
Yeah.
Right, and so the word equity is important, and we've drawn inspiration from a national group called Policy Link. I think Jane actually
Yeah,
has
we have the report
a
here.
report that they released a few years ago,
2014. Yeah.
and the title of it is Minnesota's Tomorrow,
Okay.
Equity is the Superior Growth Model. It's like,
Very
that's so
excellent.
close to our title, our
Titles.
label,
Yeah.
bringing
Absolutely.
things back
Yeah,
around to
it,
that.
it really inspired us
Superior
for
growth.
this work ahead.
Absolutely.
And we
They
yeah.
documented these disparities
Right. 4 years
with
ago.
maps showing
Yeah.
how diverse Minnesota is getting and how this was the most important
So these are
way to
actual
look at
fact.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
and things are obviously going to change somewhat, perhaps with the new census information, which we need to put in a plug. Everybody needs to be counted, and that's something else that we're going to be talking about at the Granite Falls gathering. Is that the census is coming up? It is so dependent on all of us being counted, and so. Yeah.
So what is your expectation
for.
for going to the Granite Falls?
Yeah.
What are your expectations?
Well, we're hoping to bring upwards of 150 to 200 people to the event,
Right.
and we hope to get some local and statewide news coverage of it, and I'll be helping with that. And
You're a
write-
journalist.
I'm a
He's
journalist.
the news guy.
And
Yep.
we'll be writing articles about it ourselves, op-eds and so forth, and begin popularizing the idea of equity as the.
Be sure to call on me too
Yes.
to come in and
Well,
be part
will.
of
we
this.
hope you
Yeah.
can come and join us.
Yeah.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
invited me
Yeah.
to come to Granite Falls, so
Right.
I can't
Please
wait to
do.
be there.
Yeah.
And
Well, your
visit.
expertise in this whole realm of empowerment and the important the great value of diversity and immigration and of course you're an immigrant yourself, and
Absolutely.
we're so glad you're a Minnesotan.
Thank you very much. And I will be a Minnesotan for a very long time.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah.
Well, we got about 6 minutes left. Would you please, Jane and Dane, take about a couple minutes each and just tell the public something that it's, in connection to what we talk about. It looks as if we're bringing hope to the middle class, bringing hope to the poor, bringing hope to anybody facing these disparities, including myself. So what can you tell the public?
Well, let's see. I think maybe a theme that I would pick is you have nothing to fear
Right.
but fear itself. And I stole that from FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who in the middle of the
In another
Depression,
tough time.
in the middle of the Depression, with 30% unemployment and just a country that looked like it was going to fall
Slam
apart,
down.
and maybe even come under the sway of a dictator, or just a worst period, perhaps the worst period in American history,
Right.
next to the Civil War. And fear is a big problem. People are low-income white folks are blaming, or too many of them are blaming the wrong people for their problems. Fear is is a huge impediment to
Right.
to coming together.
Right.
And people just need to understand that their neighbor doing better is not it's not coming out of their wallet. That the things we do to lift people up are going to help everybody.
Right.
And the states and nations that are doing better by equity are doing better all the way through,
All over.
top
Yeah.
to bottom.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And if we share some of our white privilege, we will benefit in the long run.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jane?
Yeah, I mean, just to
Yeah.
build on that, you know, people think of this static pie, you know,
Right.
that it's just one size, and I just want to make sure I get my piece of it. And
If somebody gets a
sorry,
little more, that's
then
less for
that's
me.
less for me.
Right.
And you know, we want to grow the pie, and the pie is growable. In
Absolutely.
fact, as Dane said, you know, with an equity model for our thriving, we're going to add billions and trillions
Absolutely.
to our economy. But that does take investment, but it's investment, it's not taking away. And so the message I think that I'd love to take out of our Granite Falls gathering and the process as a whole is that idea of abundance, not scarcity.
Right.
Not fear. We want to unite people, not divide them. And I think we unite them by just reminding ourselves that we are all Minnesotans.
Absolutely.
No matter whether we came here 5 minutes ago or we've been here for thousands of years. And so we want to be able to work together. And, you know, I would go so far as to say it's about love.
Right.
It's
Right.
about the love we have as neighbors, and not the division.
Right.
So, so we hope to see that kind of connection
Right.
coming out. Yeah.
Unification.
Yeah.
Unification is the
Yeah.
biggest word in here.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I have to say to both of you that I can't be grateful enough to hearing this message. You know, I've been here for over 20 years,
Yeah.
and I've been doing this since 2012, I think. And I've been having some great people come in here and talk about very beautiful, great things. But I think that this one discussion here really hit me. It really,
Thank you.
I really had to really control myself.
Well,
Sitting here.
that means a lot
That
to us,
does,
Roberta.
yeah.
It
It
really
does.
does.
Because I'm an immigrant,
Yeah.
you know, and
Yeah.
it felt a little bit different really sitting here and realizing that somebody think about the kind of disparities that I have been going through. And we talk about education, you know, and I think about my kids as well
Yeah.
that go to
Right.
school, and
Right.
I almost thinking maybe I have to move out of the area and move somewhere else to Edina or something like that so he can get a better education.
Yeah.
Right.
But we shouldn't be thinking like that, that we have to travel distantly just to get a better education. Education can be better anywhere
Right.
in
Exactly.
Minnesota.
Yeah.
And so I can't
That's so
thank you
true.
enough. I
That's so
really
true.
can't thank you enough that you put your lives on the line to really work hard to make sure
Right.
that
Yeah.
we have one
One
Minnesota
Minnesota.
equity blueprint,
Yes.
which we're going
Right.
to give it to whoever that person,
governor
Give it to
governor may
ourselves
be.
And the new
Yeah.
legislature,
Yeah.
and we are very optimistic that
Right.
this idea will take hold.
It's going to take hold.
Yes.
So I just want to say thank you so much. It's been amazing having you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
informative,
Yeah.
very,
Thank you,
very
Roberta.
informative. I can't wait to see you here again.
And we'll see you in Granite
and we'll
Falls.
see you in Granite
We'll
Falls.
see you in
that's
Grand
right.
Falls.
Yes.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Great.
And
Thank
to the viewers, I like to say that there is always a light at the dark tunnel. We've been waiting for so long, but this is the time. And we are thankful for this guest that came. And so with that said, have a good night. That was amazing.
That's really
Great.
good.
Thank you.
Wow.
Best-
I had to really.
Best TV show we've had. We've been involved in.
Yeah.